Good morning, everybody. My name is Craig Stewart. I will be your host over the next hour and a half. And a little bit about myself. I'm a specialized consultant with workplace safety and prevention services, and I have the good fortune of only doing confined space work. That's the only type of work that I consult on, and it keeps me quite busy. In terms of my background, previous to my experience with WSPS, I was a specialized consultant with Toyota, um, certainly working in this realm, but many others. I hold professional firefighter qualifications and worked in the emergency services as an incident commander for confined space, and I also worked in the ambulance for a little while too as well. So in terms of what I do, I assist groups and companies across Canada, both federally and provincially, with their confined space needs in terms of uh, training, hazard identification, rescue planning, the full gamut, depending on what their needs are. And today, I wanted to take some time and share with the group here what I'm seeing across both Ontario as of late, why I think I'm seeing some of the things, and dispel some of the myths um, that we might hold or preconceived notions that we might have about confined space. Um, Hopefully, we can clear some of those up. I do want to make it interactive. If you do have questions, I'll either answer that question as we go, or perhaps I'll just ask to hold that question till the end so I can share it out a little bit more broadly in terms of an answer. But I do want to be interactive. I want to keep it light. And again, if there's things that come up while I'm presenting, and I may prompt you as well with some questions throughout my presentation, please, I invite you to share your responses in the chat box. Nonetheless, let's jump into it. So today's session is called Requirements for Implementing a Compliant Confined Space Program. And maybe I'll just share why I picked that title. As I do consulting, and I do get to visit different groups in various stages of their journey in confined space. Um, uh, there is lots of non-compliance out there. There's lots of things that need help leveling up and certainly support in terms of health and safety requirements and the reg requirements. But it's not that the companies are trying to, take shortcuts. It's just a situation of you don't know what you don't know. And hopefully throughout today, I can dispel some of those myths and again, go through the requirements of what compliance looks like in Ontario. All right, let's jump in. So the MLTSD is collecting a little bit of information. This is optional, but should you wish to share a little bit of information, there's a short survey collecting demographic information on behalf of the ministry. You can use that QR code, and what it will require is today's function. It's just 3 short questions, and should you want to participate in that, you can, and I believe that the link for this is also in the chat. So just a little bit of housekeeping before we jump in. The session's scheduled for an hour and a half. We'll see where we land in terms of that timing. It is an online environment. And again, I want to make sure that it does feel that way, like a community here. If we want to keep those lines of communication open, the chat, please use the raise hand if you have a question as well. In an emergency in your workplace, follow your procedures. For sure, distractions, of course. Try and be present. It's important that we come together and take the time to share thoughts with like-minded individuals. I have no question we'll all be respectful. And there is my email address if you choose to reach me. And again, I offer that broadly and openly. You can email me anytime with any questions, whether it's regarding confined space or any other safety requirements. Okay, so the question is for yourself, does your company have a formal and for confined space program? Are you currently entering? Maybe just in the chat, yes or no, is your company currently participating in confined space entries? Maybe we'll just start off with that. How familiar are you with that program, and what specifically do you want to get out of today's session? And again, I feel free to share some of those thoughts as well in the chat. As I mentioned, questions, I hope they do come up because that's the intent of our session is to exchange and share information. And some of the questions, perfect. So lots of entries. Some of the questions, again, they might be out of scope. I might reserve them till the end. And again, perhaps there's a question that I would have to require some research. And again, I'm data driven, so I would always get back to you if I wasn't able to answer you here today. Our objectives today, by the end of this AV connection, it's my goal that you will be able to define what is a confined space, the proper definition. And usually this is one of the ones that I'll talk about when we get there. Some of the things that I hear, what people think is a confined space in comparison to the legal definition. We're going to just quickly talk about and recall the structure of the confined space legislation in Ontario, what that looks like. Recall the elements of the confined space program, roles and responsibilities for the supervisor, the entrant, and the attendant. We're going to talk about some common hazards and some of the things that we can find in confined space and the associated controls, how we're going to make sure that we mitigate some of those hazards. Identify basic requirements for safe entry and rescue. And again, rescue is one of those complex topics, certainly dependent on if we're doing horizontal or vertical entries. And hopefully we can open up some of those, dispel some of those myths and answer some of the questions today. We also want to recognize the importance of record keeping. And usually, this is certainly done at the administrative level, but it is a very, very vital component of the program to ensure due diligence, and especially in the unfortunate circumstances, if there is an event, that the company can demonstrate how they perform confined space through those documents. As you are all likely aware, I don't think anybody's, under the myth that confined spaces are not dangerous. They're incredibly dangerous. And at WSPS, it is the highest risk portfolio that we consult on. They do pose hazards to life, and again, we had a good year last year. Actually, I looked last night, and the statistics showed that there was no reported fatalities. However, that has not been the case always. In fact, there's been quite a few fatalities across Canada. Atmosphere being the major hazard, usually a lack of oxygen, is the result of these fatalities. And what happens too is, as you can see through the stats here, 80% of the deaths in confined spaces are a result of atmosphere and 60% of the rescuers. And that just demonstrates that the training is lacking. The attendant is wanting to assist that person in peril in the space, and they find themselves entering the space and succumbing to the same circumstances that the person that they were trying to help. Well-intentioned, poorly trained rescuers, unfortunately, leads to that high statistic. What are some examples of confined spaces in your workplace? And share some of the spaces, just, a brief description. Is it a tank? Is it a vessel? Is it a manhole? What are some of the spaces you guys are entering? If you could throw it in the chat. I work in the ag sector. Certainly the tanks are common and manholes. Some of the usual suspects on the screen here. Grain silos for sure. Tanks. Crawl space, interesting one. We'll have to talk about that one, Jason. Keep that in mind, Jason, specifically that one when we talk about the definition. Trenches, pits, sump holes for sure. Sewage pits for sure. Absolutely. So a lot of common, yeah, some of the usual suspects here. Hey, Sam, what is a mash? Is that a mash tunnel? And I see flying monkeys here. I suspect you're a brewery. Yes. Yeah, I've worked with a lot, actually several breweries. I'd like to connect with you sometime. I have some questions. Furnaces. Absolutely. Okay, good. Sounds like there's some good experience in the call today, and I certainly might draw from that as well throughout the presentation. Ship vessels? Yeah, okay. Excellent. I do see the question about the contractor. I will come back to that question. I will come back to that one. Let's jump in here. So in Ontario, let's just break down again. It sounds like there's some good, well-trained personnel in the room today, but let's do a recap of the legislation in Ontario, what it looks like as it pertains to confined space. In terms of the history, in 2006 is when the big changes came, and this is when they consolidated the regulations. And what they introduced in 2006 was the requirement for rescue. This was a huge gap previous to this, that there was no planned rescue. I mean, there might have been a plan, but it was either a conversation or a wish at best. But in 2006, the requirement for on-site rescue came into play. And in 2011, all the amendments were consolidated. All the regulatory requirements respecting confined space fell under the Occupational Health and Safety Act. So, a couple big changes there, and changes for the good. We're certainly seeing some of that. We're seeing the results today, right? Here we are today talking about it. And sharing that information, and something that probably wouldn't have occurred previous to these legislative changes. So, um, yeah. Yeah. Let's jump in. So, structure of confined space in Ontario. Everybody's familiar with the Green Book. The Occupational Health and Safety Act divided up into two separate sections. One is the Act in the front. And as we're aware, the Act outlines the roles and responsibilities for the three workplace parties. Can somebody throw in the chat? Let's just make sure we're on the same level here. What are those three workplace parties that we need to be certain of? What's one of them? I'm going to keep talking here. Following the act, we have the regulations. So in terms of the act sets out the roles and responsibilities for the employer, the worker, and the supervisor, and all play a distinct role and have distinct responsibilities as it pertains to implementing a confined space program. Underneath the Act, we have the regulations, and because we're making entry into confined spaces, we are now bound by the requirements of Regulation 63205, which is the confined space specific regulation. The additional two regulations here are 851 industrial establishments, and usually that is the main sector that I work in. It doesn't have to be, though. We could be talking about 213. We could be talking about the ag sector as well. In terms of Regulation 833, this is where the occupational exposure limits, the tables are housed, that we can determine what those safe levels are. I believe it's the 725 most common elements used in Ontario are captured within those tables. I may be off by a few either way on that number. But the intention is that we can use this regulation to determine our safe occupational exposure limits to chemicals and toxic substances that may be present or introduced into the space. Further to the regulations, we have best practices. And as you are likely aware, a best practice is not a legal requirement. Now, there's a caveat to that. Should your own policies and procedures allude to or indicate that you follow these best practices, the ministry will hold you to this as your minimum legal requirement. Where this is very, very common is the best practice that pertains to confined space, which is CSA Z1006. At WSPS, we certainly introduced that best practice as part of our hazard assessment process. And what that best practice does is it just redefines or defines a little bit tighter the scope of the regulation. As you know, the Green Book is very broad in nature by intention. And what this best practice does is narrows down that scope a little bit to better understand the requirements and make things a little bit safer. One of the other documents listed here is the MLTSD Confined Space Guideline, and you will be receiving a follow-up email today. And within that email is a link to that document. I love this guide, and I love it because I use it for a lot of my customers in the sense that it really breaks down the most common questions that come up in confined space and answers them in plain language. It's the all the questions the employer would ask, a worker would ask, a supervisor would ask, and it puts them into clear, plain language. I highly recommend that you really take a look at that resource at the end of the presentation when that email is sent out to you. So let's come to the definition because here's where some of the myths come up. I'm going to read out this definition, but quite often, let me just start off with what I hear. Craig, there's only one way in or out of the space. It's a confined space. There's only one way in or out, or it's super tight to get in there. It's really, really restrictive to get in there. Although both those descriptions are pertinent and relevant to an assessment, and important information, they have actually no bearing on the definition of confined space provincially. A confined space in Ontario must reach three pillars to satisfy the definition. All three requirements must be met for confined space to be deemed a confined space in Ontario. So a confined space is a fully or partially enclosed space. And this is the easiest metric I feel to satisfy because basically any room we're in or any space we're in is likely fully or partially enclosed. And again, the definition is broad for intention. It's designed to capture all spaces. The second part, this one's a little bit more tricky. A space that is not designed and constructed for continuous human occupancy. And this is where there could be some debate come in. And Jason, that's why I was asking for you to specifically look at this definition when you're entering crawl spaces. Um, so let's break that down a little bit. For continuous human occupancy, people work in office buildings and people work in sewers. Both those statements are true. One is designed for continuous human occupancy because it has building code, lighting, ventilation, fire mitigation, emergency response capabilities. Unlike the other space, like a sewer, which is certainly a space that is designed to be worked in, but it's not designed to check in at 8 a.m. and punch out at 4 o'clock p.m. on a daily basis. It's not designed for continuous human occupancy. The intention of the space was to perform service or maintenance, and that's it, or inspection, visual inspection as well. Unlike an office building that's built to building code and has those safety parameters and life-saving measures built into it. So that's really what we have to ask ourselves when we're looking at a space. What is the intention of it? And when I think about a crawl space designed for storage, it's designed to be occupied or serviced. But perhaps there could be another element to it, and we'll get there. So far we've covered that a confined space is fully or partially enclosed. It's not designed for continuous human occupancy, and in which an atmospheric hazard may occur because of its construction, location, or contents, or because of the work that's done in it. And this is really, really important when we talk about atmospheric hazards. So let me just slide my bar over here. I'm going to talk a little bit more in detail when we go through our hazard assessment section, but in general, an atmospheric hazard, we're talking about whether the atmosphere within the space likely is flammable, whether it's toxic, whether it's oxygen deficient, or whether there's other elements that might cause a respiratory or an atmospheric concern. But in a later slide, I'll go into a little bit more detail on that one. So let's take a look at our roadmap. And considering lots of the group today is already performing confined space work, we're just going to go through the elements here and see how they pair up with what you're currently doing. So likely everybody is, if you've been to a WSPS session before, this slide should be of no, or should be familiar when we get to the race slide. So we want to recognize the first thing we're going to ask ourselves is the job to be conducted in a confined space. And if we know because we just understood that definition, the answer is either no Well, we still need to assess hazards. That's important. It doesn't negate the responsibility to assess the hazards allocated to the task, implement the required controls, safely complete the job, and get home safely. It's okay to arrive home tired. It's okay to arrive home um, sore. It's not okay to arrive home injured or ill from work. So, uh, we all have the same goal. The goal is to put that key in the front door and get home safely. We have those reasons why we want to be at home safely, and that's the common goal that we all likely share is to perform our work each day and get home safely. Let's take this in another direction though. If the job is a confined space, well, now that triggers the requirement for the employer to implement a confined space program. Within the program are the elements, the roles and responsibilities that the employer and the staff have to undertake to safely perform safe work in Ontario. We need to assess the space and the job hazards, create safe work plans, complete the permits, and this is a big component. This is a permitted entry into these spaces. And do the same thing. We want to safely complete the task and arrive home. Let's take a look at some of the elements of the program itself. So once we've established, we know that we've made that decision, that we've determined that the space that we need to enter is fully or partially enclosed. It's not designed for continuous human occupancy, and there's atmospheric hazards within it that may be present because of its location, its contents, or work performed into it. We're introducing work that brings that hazard with it. We know that we have to take that next step in our program and assess hazards. And this is the slide that I was kind of alluding to earlier. This one should be familiar to anybody who's been to a WSPS event. We utilize the RACE system: recognize, assess, control, and evaluate. Let's look at what that looks like when we apply it to the workplace for confined space. We want to identify the actual hazards associated with the confined space and the environment. So in Ontario, if you are entering confined spaces, you would have to have a program. And one of the elements in your program is your inventory. It's a legal requirement that the employer undertakes the responsibility to identify confined spaces within their property and building, um, or their facility, whatever that looks and feels like, and document them. And I mean, this is a pretty simple thing. It's just a simple Excel sheet indicating the space, the location, and whether it is or is not a confined space, or listing that it is a confined space. Um, a hazard assessment is only required for spaces that you are entering. Otherwise, you just need to list the spaces that you're not entering. I hope that makes sense. In terms of assessing, rate the hazard by determining the probability and severity of each hazard identified. So when we know that we're entering a space, we want to perform a hazard assessment and address the hazards that we see allocated to making safe entry. We want to control those hazards. And like anything with, anytime we perform the RACE process, it's important to go back, circle back, and evaluate, making sure that the controls that we introduced were performing as expected and did not introduce additional hazards. The program itself, the employer has the duty to ensure the program is adequate. This is a really important term. This is one of the ones that I've highlighted here because it's a legal term. Adequate means when used in relation to a procedure, plan, material, device, or thing means that it is sufficient for both its intended and actual use and sufficient to protect the worker from occupational illness or occupational injury. It's not just a word that we can use casually. When we say, oh, that's adequate, that's adequate. It really meets this, it has to meet this definition when we apply it to our program policies and procedures for confined space. The employer must provide a method for recognizing each confined space. And again, we just went through that definition, and through that definition, being our metrics, we would be able to filter through which spaces are or not a confined space. Method for assessing the hazards. Method for the development of entry and rescue procedures. So we don't just plan for making safe entry, we also have to plan for the emergency in the event that we have a team member or members that are unable to exit the space. A method of training the employees and what training looks like. Requirements before entry into a confined space. Yeah, so I just want to touch on a couple of these, especially the training. One of the, the myths is that, Craig, somebody will say to me, Craig, I've had my staff take on this 2 hour online course, and I'm not certainly harping on online courses. They're of great, great value. The point I'm making here is that confined space training is a twofold expectation. One is the theory training that is required. And again, the intention is for both the entrant and the attendant to receive the training that's required so they can understand their roles and responsibilities to perform those tasks. There's also awareness training. There could be what's referred to as affected workers in the area. So if if you are performing confined space work, there could be workers that are exposed to that work site through consequence of their own work. And again, they might not require the full gamut of entrant or rescue training or attendant, but awareness training is really, really important. You don't know what you don't know. And if you've never been taught what a confined space is and you read the sign, it doesn't have much relevance to you unless you're going to form your own opinion on what that hazard looks or feel like. So that's the benefit of awareness training. The second part of that is that it's not just theory. Like anything, when we introduce workers to equipment, tools, or things in the workplace, machines, they also have to be trained on how to utilize them properly. They have the right to know about the hazards that are allocated or associated with using that equipment. And the same can be said for confined space. Whether there's equipment as part of the procedures in terms of davit arms, tripods, winches, harnesses, lifelines, pulleys, rope systems, carabiners. All these things are need to also be trained. So we both need to train in both the theory components and the practical components of confined space. The training required for workers, general confined space training, hazard training, plan specific training, meaning that the worker should be familiar with the procedures for entering the space that you're performing work in, whether it's for PM activity, service, um, whether it's visual inspection. Uh, they should be practicing those skill sets. Confined space skill sets are some of the most perishable skill sets there are in the industry. It's like anything else. A lot of people that undertake first aid would have a great deal of difficulty executing some of the techniques that they were taught just a few weeks later if they haven't practiced. The same can be said with confined space. On-site rescue procedures and equipment use, and that's really important too. We saw when there was those legislative changes in the introduction that on-site rescue procedures were a requirement now. When we talk about on-site procedures too, there's not just the table talk, where there's a group of people sitting around saying, well, you do this and I'll do that. It's not that at all. It's a planned document outlining the steps undertaken by the rescuers, to extract that person that's unable to ambulate themselves out of that space as a result of two things. One, a hazard in the space, or more than common is an existing medical condition or phobia that occurs in the space, resulting in that person needing assistance out of the space. Other required training for sure. This is important too, right? We could have to have that, whether it's respiratory protection, and we know that when we protect against a respiratory hazard and provide a respirator to a worker, we are now triggered by introducing a respiratory protection program that would contain elements like fit usage, care, storage, fit testing, all those types of things that have to be a part of your in alignment with your confined space program too. And again, same that can be said for lockout, controlling energy sources within the space. You have to be trained on those elements as well. just looking at, okay, yeah, just catching up on some messages. Let's talk about the hazard assessment because this is the real meat and potatoes of the program itself. Let's see what we. So following our roadmap here, we're just, oops, sorry, back up here once. Um, we know that the work that we're performing meets the definition of a confined space. We have taken the responsibility as an employer to implement a confined space program. Within that program, it's going to give us expectations for hazard assessment. So, what's on a hazard assessment? What does that look like? The employer shall appoint a person with adequate knowledge and training and experience to carry out the assessment, shall maintain a record containing the detail of the person's knowledge, training, and experience before the worker enters a confined space. What what is the word that I'm looking for? See who gets it in the chat here. How can we describe the attributes of that person? What is one word that we could use to capture all those elements that that person has? Employers are responsible for hiring what type of supervisors in Ontario? There it is, Jason. Yeah, exactly. Right. Competent. It's a word that's misunderstood. I find, when I'm working with a lot of groups and companies, whether they're steel companies, they've been in business for a long time, and the staffing is usually promoted within. That person that started on the floor once upon a time has earned their way and righteously moved themselves up that corporate ladder and is likely holding a managerial or supervisory position. Um, but and when I think about the definition, a competent supervisor in Ontario must have knowledge, training, experience, and understanding the law. And it's usually the fourth pillar that falls apart. They're very, very competent in their trade of steel. They're very, very competent in their skill sets. They know the factory backwards. They know every piece of equipment. But if you ask them to reference what regulation they work under, some of them really actually struggle. They're not aware. They're not aware of that legal requirement part. They're aware that a green book exists, but they could not navigate it competently to their own industry. And again, I see that how that happens, right? Like it's just human nature is you've got that person in the building that's just not had the necessity to extend themselves to that green book, right? And so usually that's where the gap is in some of the supervisors that I see. It applies both to regular positions and both for workers or supervisors that are supervising confined space work as well. Let's go to the next part. Yeah, and again, here was my question. Who else does an employer appoint with these attributes? And that's that supervisor in Ontario. It's incumbent upon us in Ontario for employers to hire competent supervisors. The assessment must consider hazards that may exist due to the design, the construction, the location, or the contents. And the contents is really important as well of the confined space and the hazards that may develop while work is done inside the confined space in its normal operating condition. And what does this mean? This is one of the things that I see quite often. I'll say I have customers that would say to me things like, let's pick a baking oven, for example, and um, they would say, Craig, we have this baking oven, but Craig, we would never ever put any workers in there unless we open the doors and we turn off all the energy sources and we let it air out for a couple days. And then we bring in fans and we cool it down and then we put workers in there. So, it's not a confined space, Craig. It doesn't meet the definition. There's no atmospheric hazard. The intention in Ontario is that when we assess spaces, that it's done in what's referred to as their normal operating condition. And this is consistently referenced both throughout the regulations and the act in terms of an expectation. We can't modify the space to meet the definition. We can't adjust it into some superficial state to negate the definition, we have to assess in what's referred to its normal operating condition. And the intention is to capture all the hazards that are allocated to the equipment prior to entry. And unless we do that in its normal operating condition, we can't capture all the hazards. And the regulations does expect us to capture them all. So I just wanted to share a little bit on that point, normal operating condition. I said I would come back to atmospheric hazards, and as I alluded to in the beginning of the presentation, um, this is what is really affecting and impacting both injuries and worst case scenarios, fatalities, is the atmosphere within these spaces. A lot of the safety hazards we can certainly overcome. We can mitigate their risk threshold to an acceptable level and create a safe entry, but it's the atmosphere that we really have to be cognizant of to ensure that we're not impacting worker safety. So what can that look or feel like? An accumulation of flammable, explosive, or combustible agents. Here is the mix. The oxygen content in the atmosphere is less than 19.5 or exceeding 23% by volume. So 19.5 being the minimum percentage by volume that sustains life. Anything less than that, it's going to impact our systems within our body. At slightly less than 19.5, we'll start to feel a little bit drowsy. At 17, you're going to start to feel very, very sick. And anything less than that, you're likely to lose consciousness permanently. So anything less than 19.5 is an atmospheric hazard. Anything exceeding that space, by volume, 23%. If we're exceeding 23%, that's also a hazard. But you might think to yourself, why would that be a hazard? Too much oxygen, like that's kind of a good thing. What's the problem with exceeding 23% by volume? You can tell me in the chat. What does that make the space? Yeah, for sure, right? We have an oxidizer now in there. And you've likely maybe historically seen, somebody who is living on oxygen might have a sign on their front door, no smoking, right? You enter the house, no smoking, because it's such an oxygen-enriched environment. Continuing on with the definition, atmospheric contaminants included gases, vapors, fumes, dust, or mist that could result in acute health effects and pose immediate threat to life or interfere with a person's ability to escape unaided from a confined space. These are really important statements also that are sometimes misunderstood. So what's relevant in the first line is result in acute, not chronic, acute health effects that pose an immediate threat to life. And so again, I'm just thinking out loud about the crawl space situation. And, when I think about what's in a crawl space that might present an atmospheric hazard, certainly dust and particulate, but it's unlikely that the percentage or the ratio of particulate in the air for dust would reach the threshold of an acute health effect and pose an immediate threat to life. Is it an atmospheric hazard? Of course it is. Sometimes we wear an N95 to mitigate the hazards associated with dusty environments, but it doesn't necessarily reach the threshold of the definition. The second part, interfere with a person's ability to escape unaided in a confined space. And sometimes the thought behind that statement is, well, Craig, there's the room's got, say, flour in it or some sort of particulate that might be an agitator. Craig, my worker might get some of this particulate on their hand and touch their face, and it might irritate their eye, and they might not know where the door is. And although that's a good what if scenario, and in health and safety, we want to not necessarily rely on or focus on what if scenarios. So we certainly want to be cognitive of possibilities, but creating risk scenarios that are vague are not necessarily beneficial. What this statement is referring to is interfere with a person's ability to escape unaided, meaning that there's some element in that room that's exceeding a either an OEL exposure limit or a NIOSH exposure limit, and that overexposure is impacting the person cognitively to to be not able to escape unaided. And so it's a really, really definitive threshold there. It's not just a bland statement where there could be something in the room that might, you know, it could be furniture, right? I don't know. But nonetheless, the intention of the statement is to ensure that you are capturing occupational exposure limits or elements that would exceed occupational exposure limits, either through the tables in 833 or through NIOSH. I've said a lot there. All right. In addition to the atmosphere, and again, I wanted to focus on the atmosphere because it is the one that's impacting worker safety the most, but it's not to say that there's not additional hazards. Whether it's atmospheric hazards, like we've kind of just covered that section, whether it's chemical hazards, compressed gas, flammable elements, physical hazards could be in the space. Temperature, both hot and cold, are impact confined space entries very, very robustly. A lot of entries are done outside, and that temperature does need to come into consideration, or the vice versa. Those entries are done in very, very hot environments, and we have to consider those physical hazards as well. Same can be said with noise, especially when the noise in the space or the area is impacting the ability for the entrant and the attendant to communicate with each other. That's important as well. Psychosocial hazards, something that we don't talk about as much, whether it's fear of heights, whether it's claustrophobia, is ensuring that the workers that we're asking to enter these spaces have that cognitive ability to do so safely. And I kind of get asked, well, Craig, how do you filter for this? One of the usually this type of hazard or condition is captured in your fit for duty work policy. Psychosocial, or excuse me, content hazards, decomposing organic matter for sure, one of the more common elements, especially in the ag sector. Residual content, I see sump pits and manholes in the list, and certainly that would be relevant to those spaces as well. Configuration hazards, whether that space is compartmentalized, whether the interior is sloped at the bottom, and certainly for the grain bins in the ag sector, that's quite common, is the slope bottoms. Let me come back to the top one there. Just want to finish off the list on the right, though. Biohazards, and again, whether that's animals, dung, whether it's fungus, molds, that's our living hazards within the space. Sitting water could present that as well. Our MSD hazards, of course, getting in and out of these spaces it's not always easy. We have to sometimes put ourselves in very, very uncomfortable different positions. Sometimes the work position is not comfortable. And also considering what tasks we're performing in the space, right? We know those three metrics for MSD injuries. The number one thing injuring workers in Ontario, forced posture, duration, and repetition. All those elements need to be considered. And again, whether we utilize administrative controls, moving somebody out of the space and reintroducing somebody to perform the task to share the load, or what that looks and feels like. But it does need to be considered. And one of the most important things, too, is external hazards. What's going on around the space? Is it adjacent equipment? Is it pedestrians? Is it traffic? All those could impact our safety in the space. Just moving to the top, building on our last slide, assessing dangerous atmospheres. And a lot of the times, we have to be diligent in this area. We cannot see or smell most toxic gas or vapors. They don't necessarily have great warning properties. Cannot determine the level of oxygen simply through, doing a taste test. It has to be done through an active 4-gas monitor. When we do test for atmosphere as well, because different elements will stratify based on their weight within the space, when we are testing that air quality, we have to do it at all the different levels that the worker will be performing work. Different chemicals, or sorry, different atmospheric hazards rather, will stratify differently based on their density. So air having a density of 1, some elements are going to sit higher in that space and some elements are going to sit lower. And finally, this is true too. I use the example from the Toyota paint shop when I would sometimes enter that shop in the beginning of my career in safety. I would, the odor was quite pungent. Um, but after a while, it became, it was definitely tolerable. It's not that it was more tolerable, it was the fact that my senses had become a little bit fatigued, and you're desensitized a little bit to that scent, and so we can't trust that as a source for smelling hazards. Okay, let's take a look at the entry plan. Through our confined space hazard assessment, we've talked about the need for a competent person, somebody who has knowledge, training, experience, and understands the law, to conduct a formal hazard assessment on a space prior to a worker entering it. The intention is to capture all the hazards that are allocated to that space in what's referred to as its normal operating condition, I mean, not modified. We're capturing the hazards as they are present as the machine normally operates, fully energized. Once we understand all those hazards and we've captured those hazards, we have the responsibility to mitigate those hazards. And we may not get all those hazards down to a zero, but we have to reduce them to a reasonable, acceptable risk threshold. Um, this is part of our safe entry plan. So all those things that made it unsafe for us to enter, we're going to document how we're going to control those hazards and how we're going to make safe entry into the space. Before any worker enters a confined space, the employer must ensure that an adequate, there's that word adequate, right? So just to recap, um, we need that plan to be sufficient for the health and safety and protection, excuse me, of the worker. It can be incorporated with permit. It indicates the procedures for the control of hazards identified in the hazard assessment. Okay, so just as I indicated, we're going to mitigate what we've captured. Ensure the plan for the confined space has been developed and implemented by a competent person. Again, it makes sense, right? How could you have somebody that doesn't understand the hazards doing the preparation for this type of work? That's why it's so important. That's why the word is used, and that's why it's defined very, very clearly. The employer shall ensure that the plan is reviewed as often as necessary to ensure that it remains adequate. And the intention there is certainly, we may have different experiences, but my experience at Toyota was the assembly shop could change overnight. A process could move over, it could move back, it could be completely removed. And when that happened, and there was large changes that would occur during non-shift activity and sometimes during shift, it impacted other equipment processes. And this is quite common in confined space too. Changes in equipment or the way things run and move could impact the confined space hazard assessment and the entry plan. So it's incumbent upon the employer to exercise their due diligence and ensure that they recognize that in the event that there's been a change to a space, that change has been adequately captured within the documents, and if there's additional hazards, that those hazards have also been mitigated. In my experience, communication is one of the most effective tools in health and safety. Um, I've been a part of probably close to 100 Ministry of Labor investigations. And the common element in a lot of those investigations is a breakdown of communication. It's a very, very effective tool, but it's also devastating when it's not used. It's free. It's usually the middle management level too, where there's a breakdown. That's usually where it starts to break down. But the result of a lot of safety incidents is just simply poor communication. Safe entry plan. We also have to control the, mechanical and electrical hazards within a space. And one of the things I wanted to dispel was that just because there is an energy source within a space, If we're not exposed to the hazard through our work, we don't necessarily have to lock it out or protect against it. For example, if I'm working in a valve pit and there's a 2-inch steel gas line, Schedule 40 pipe gas line running through that space, and it's bracketed to the wall, um, and my work has no impact or involvement with that gas line running through the space, there's no need to shut that gas line off. It's for hazards that we are exposed to, electrical and mechanical hazards that we can expose to through the entry or through the work performed in the space. Stopping all types of energy flows, we have to account for that. And, the usual suspects in the industry, obviously hydraulic, pneumatic, and electrical energy will be the three most common ones. But it's not to say that that's the only thing on the list. There could be kinetic, there could be others as well. Be broad in your investigation of your energy sources. Securing the machine and device into a zero energy state, right? This is the state where it is deemed safe through lockout, that now that we can enter that space and know that the energies have been secured. Placement of a lock and tag on an energy isolating device, and whether in this picture it's indicated on that disconnect, but it could be isolation points on the equipment itself or valving. Remain in accordance with established procedures for sure. And this is just indicating that, make sure that, despite it being a confined space, primary work, that the lockout portion of it, that we're adhering to the expectations of the organization and following the policies and procedures. Obviously, ensuring that we're not removing locks where we shouldn't be, or using incorrect locks or those types of things, right? We want to make sure we're in compliance with all the elements of safety that we're using. Safe entry plan also has to consider personal protective equipment, not just the selection, but the use and procedures associated with it, right? We have to consider skin, head, hand, foot, eyes, ear. We talked about some of those hazards previously. Respiratory protection, of course. And we know that once we introduce a respirator as part of a mitigation tool for an atmospheric hazard, it does trigger the requirements for a program. One of those elements that is not always popular is being clean shaven. However, it is super, super important, honestly. When a respirator does not fit tightly around the face, the hazard will follow the path of least resistance, usually around the bridge of the nose, and it'll bypass the filter completely. So it is really, really important that the respirator fits correctly, and that if it does require that seal, it's not a PAPR, that you are clean shaven. It's a bit of a drag for the beard lovers. Fall protection system, that's correct as well. A lot of the times that our work might not necessarily be at grade level, or we could be having a vertical entry into the space, not horizontal, right? We're not walking and crawling into the space, but we're being lowered into the space. And this also requires the fall protection elements to be introduced and trained as well. And just to reinforce, like the equipment used in confined space, whether it's winches, whether it's tripods, whether it's usually not a frequent activity. So the tools and equipment are not always intimately familiar with the people performing the work. It's really important that the employer recognizes that they have to keep up that knowledge, that base knowledge set, to ensure competency and the safety to perform the work. If it requires some additional training, some practicing, some pulling the gear out, that's probably a good decision. Let's talk about roles and responsibilities within the space itself. So, safe entry plan, the duties of a confined space supervisor. Well, as we go through them here, a lot of these will certainly be repetitive, but familiar. The entry supervisor authorizes the entry and oversees the operations. So I just want to also state that somebody could be a confined space supervisor, meaning they're in charge of that operation, that specific task, but not necessarily be a supervisor of a regular supervisor of work. It could be a worker who's been appointed. because of their knowledge, training, experience, and their understanding of the law, the role of confined space entry supervisor, meaning they're supervising that specific work, but maybe not necessarily other work. They have to know the hazards associated with the confined space. Well, there's that common theme again, right? It's knowledge. It's knowing what can hurt us and how we've controlled those hazards. But again, without the base training, you may not be aware. Verify safe entry conditions prior to entry. And again, this is important. We want to make sure that all the things that we said and talked about and stated through our hazard assessment safe entry plan, we're going to implement those on the day of entry. And the way that we're going to confirm that through the permit, we'll get there next. Ensure acceptable entry conditions are maintained during the entry. And what does this mean? Well, this means that that person, let me say this too, that the attendant and the entry supervisor could also be one and the same. They could be performing the same, a dual role. It's not always that way. Sometimes they are separated, but sometimes they're together. Verify safe entry conditions prior to entry, for sure. Ensure acceptable entry conditions are maintained. And what does that mean? It's quite likely that attendant is also carrying or utilizing a four-gas air monitor, similar to the one that may be placed on the worker inside the space or the entrant. And they might become aware of an atmospheric hazard before the worker does. And it's their responsibility, should that hazard present itself, should that four-gas monitor alarm and alert, that they would indicate to the worker inside the entrant that it's time to extract themselves and come out of the space. Yeah, also ensuring the availability and effective of the rescue services, right? It would be incumbent upon the entry supervisor to review the hazard assessment, the safe entry plan, and the rescue plan, and to call out any indeficiencies, anything that does not sound correct, any questions that they may have. They want to make sure that the elements on the pillars are in place prior to directing that worker to break that barrier and make entry. Removing unauthorized persons, for sure. We don't want anybody in the hot zone or anybody in this area that is not necessarily, and again, confined space work usually draws curiosity. It's probably how I was introduced to it, just seeing it being performed and then being curious, what's happening over here. But again, we know the hazards that are associated with confined space. The introduction of unwanted persons in the area can only produce additional hazards. And it's important that we ask those people to move on. And again, in the event that there is a compromised equipment, air quality, cognitive ability, for whatever reason, the entry supervisor feels that the work needs to stop, they can terminate the permit, cancel the permit immediately, have everybody removed from the space. And what this would trigger is a requirement to reestablish a new permit, meaning go through the procedure again. If they wanted to make or re-entry at a later date, they couldn't utilize this permit. They would have to complete a new permit. But again, it's just that responsibility that they have where they can, in fact, terminate a confined space entry because they don't see something that looks right. Sometimes it's just a gut feeling, and sometimes it might be a visual observation. Only authorized entrants are allowed to enter the confined space and required to know about the hazards. The same thing. The entrants also have similar responsibilities. How to use all the required equipment to complete the job safely. And again, whether that's putting on a harness correctly, whether it's attaching a lifeline, whether it's connecting themselves to a tripod system or a winch, they have to know how to use the equipment. Very, very important. The procedures for maintaining communication with the attendant. For sure, that needs to be established and would certainly be captured in the safe entry plan. How is the person on the outside and the inside communicating? And is it sustainable? Does it make sense? Does it make sense that we're going to use our cell phones, but we're in a concrete building? That might not make sense. Did somebody check the batteries in the receivers of the radios? That's important. Those types of questions need to be answered. We need to make sure that at all times, whatever that strategy is, that there is an expectation that the attendant and the entrant can always communicate with each other. How to alert the attendant of conditions in the space that will impact their safety? Well, kind of falls into the last question. Um, and that's why it's so important to ensure that our communication conduit remains clear. How to exit the space safely if required. And this is important too. There'll be times perhaps a monitor might alert the person's in the space. They're wearing a personal monitor on their chest. It's measuring O2, CO, LEL, and H2S, the four common elements. And should it alert because of an oxygen deficiency, let's say oxygen cuts a little bit below 19.5, that four gas monitor starts to go off. It'll start to make an audible tone, a visual tone, or a visual indicator. The it's believed sometimes, or I've heard stories, right, where the person that gets that alert loses control, right? They become panicked and they start to exit that space in a rapid pace, whether it's running, whether it's scrambling, whether it's panicking, and hey, the monitor's going off. I have to get out. And that is true. Part of the statement's true. They do have to get out, but they have to get out safely. And there's lots of time built into a safety barrier in terms of that reading that they can simply make the cognitive decision that my alarm's going off. I need to simply calmly exit the space the same way that I entered the space. One of the rescues that we did was during training, and for this exact element was the person, that's what I'm telling the story, was we were training and they were bent over and they were breathing into their own four gas monitor, their own breath, set the alarm off, and they panicked and they tripped and they hit their head and they lost consciousness and temporarily, and it resulted into being a critical injury in a workplace, which requires notification to the ministry. And all because the worker just didn't understand that there was time built into that reading that would allow them to safely just collect their thoughts and exit that space safely. Let's complete the permit. I've alluded to the permit, and this is the difference we talked about in the roadmap that the difference between a normal job and this job is that this is a permitted entry. The permit has to be completed, is an element of the confined space program. Um, let's take a look at what's on the permit and the responsibilities. So we're at that stage. We've determined that we do have a confined space. We're following our confined space program. We're using the definition metrics to assess the spaces and determine. We've determined the spaces we're entering is a confined space that's going to trigger a hazard assessment. The hazard assessment is going to allow us to create our safe work plan and our rescue plan. We're going to complete our permits and we're going to perform our job safely. So let's take a look. The permit itself, the entry occurs. So entry into a confined space. This is a misconception too. Craig, I'm only putting my hand in there. And I would agree in most instances, perhaps that's not really a real risk. I say that just because it's true. Like a lot of instances, that's not going to be what's going to hurt you. However, we wouldn't know that. And this draws me back to the original conclusion. Let's just pretend we're putting our hand into the space. And the space had some sort of moving hazard in there. This is why it's important to capture the equipment and what's referred to its normal operating condition, because we'd have to predict the hazards we have to know the hazards that are happening with the equipment while it's running, right? And even in that example, just entering the hand into the space, well, we don't know what's behind the door or the space or the opening that allows us to put our hand in. And it might be just to manipulate a valve, but it just sort of reinforces the importance of assessing equipment in its normal running operating condition. Entry occurs the instant that a person breaks the plane of the opening with any part of their body. The permit, must be issued before entry. So that's why I have both these statements there, that as soon as we break the plane, that permit would already need to be filled out. It must be readily available, meaning that it's located at the location of the entry. And also because there's important information that's captured on the permit. Um, some of that information is the entries in and out of that space, air monitor readings and communications between the entrant and the attendant, timings, the date of the entry, all that static information will be captured. It's really, really important to demonstrate due diligence. It's also going to set out the measures and procedures to be followed. Hey, here's how we're performing this work today. It may incorporate the plan, it may incorporate training records as well. But what it is going to do is ensure that everything that we said that we were going to do, it's going to hold us to task here and ask us, do you have the hazard assessment done? Do you have a safe entry plan? Have you mitigated the hazards? It's going to list all the equipment that's required and ensure that all those pieces are there. The point is that should there be something on the permit that we cannot satisfy, it's either deficient, broken, missing, that's it. We either can replace that piece of equipment instantly or the permit does not get signed, one of two situations. Without the permit being fully satisfied, we cannot make entry into the space. Should we follow all these elements, I fully believe that when there's due diligence undertaken and that there's strong consideration and competent consideration given to a hazard assessment, paired with a safe entry plan, mitigating those hazards to an acceptable risk level, or hopefully eliminating some of the hazards, but likely not always. Um, Ensuring that we have done good atmospheric testing. I'm confident that we should be arriving home each night safely. We might be a little sore and tired, but we will not be sick or injured. However, we do have to prepare for the situations where we might have a worker that cannot exit the space, either through assistance through mechanical advantage, a winch from the outside, or under their own accord. They're either unconscious or perhaps their equipment is entangled, perhaps they've fallen, whatever that emergency is, um, we have to plan for that emergency, and it's incumbent upon the employer to develop a rescue plan. And depending on the type of rescue, and I'm going to go through those quickly, there are some more complexities in some of them than others. Some of them are quite simple, but let's see what's required. So, yeah, in the event that we can't complete the job safely, we might have to introduce our rescue plan. And one of the biggest misconceptions out there is that utilizing 911 is the rescue plan. Like we'll call 911. That is not the truth, especially in Ontario. May we use 911 services as our on-site rescue? And the answer is no. Calling 911 as your rescue is not considered to be an on-site rescue procedure. As we saw through legislation, that's the requirement, which can be ready for immediate implementation for the purpose of rescuing a worker from a confined space. Emergency services do not replace the requirements for on-site rescue procedures. They're there to help. They'll likely show up. They're going to be supportive. However, they are not the plan, and they're simply not going to jump into a space, for which there's elements or hazards that they're trying to assist somebody. Employers, sorry, remain solely responsible for ensuring that there are adequate on-site rescue procedures that are ready for immediate implementation to effectively remove a worker who has been overcome in a confined space, overcome or injured, meaning they cannot extract themselves. There's 4 different types of rescues. Type 1, Type 2, Type 3, Type 4. Type 1 is self-rescue, meaning that the entrant can simply step out of the space under their own accord. Either they're being asked to do that by the attendant is seeing a hazard present and saying, hey, time to leave. The entrant doesn't question it, they simply remove themselves from that space. With no assistance. The second one is non-entry rescue, and at all costs, we always want to avoid putting an additional worker or rescue technician in the space with somebody being rescued. We want to try and perform that rescue from outside the space, and the way that's usually done is through a mechanical advantage system or a lifeline, and I'll talk about that. In the second picture on the slide there, you'll see a worker being hoisted out of a space. And again, there's a winch above them that's being wound, allowing them to pull that person from the space without introducing a new rescuer. Um, in the third instance, there is situations where, as I mentioned, it's not likely, and this situation would be an atmospheric hazard, but there is perhaps a condition in which that the worker still cannot get themselves out of the space. Perhaps they're entangled in the equipment. Perhaps their lifeline is entangled. Perhaps they've got a leg injury. Perhaps they're going through a diabetic episode. All could be true, but they cannot get themselves out of the space independently. And this requires what's referred to as an entry rescue into a non-IDLH atmosphere, meaning the atmosphere is not immediately too dangerous to life or health. Um, and so rescue can be formed usually without a respirator in that instance. And the fourth one is the same situation. We have somebody who's incapacitated. However, we know that the atmosphere within the space is immediately dangerous to life and health. And this is complex rescue, meaning that the entrance or the people making entry to perform rescue would be doing so under a breathing system, usually an SCBA. This is not the norm. This is the very, very high level complex confined spaces. Certainly not less common than common. However, they are out there and these conditions do exist. But it's the four different types of rescues that would be utilized to extract somebody from a space in the event that there is that emergency. Just a few more slides, guys. The importance of retaining records, and then I'll open it up to any questions that might be present. Really, really important. I kind of alluded to record retention as being important. And I also alluded to being involved with the ministry in, likely 100 plus investigations. And the records are really the layers of due diligence that you can build if you're performing confined space work to demonstrate your story. And that's what the ministry is looking for is when they come in to do an investigation, they're asking themselves, what is the story this worker or employer is telling me? Is it a story of due diligence where they have got ample evidence of their training, practicing, um, their record keeping, they keep all their past permits, they have very, very sound hazard assessments. They're satisfying the definition of competency. Into contrast to, coming in as an inspector and asking for some records and having a supervisor say, oh, I'm not sure where we keep that. I'll have to get that together or whatever that looks like. That's just going to offer that inspector an opportunity to unpeel a few more layers, see what else is um, perhaps not up to par. So do yourselves a favor. Record retention, usually done at the admin level, but it's important. Keep those permits. Make sure the hazard assessments are organized, making sure that the documents are reviewed when necessary if there's been changes. Every 3 years is usually a good indicator of when you should be reviewing that inventory and asking yourself those questions. Has there been changes to this equipment? Do we have that necessity to go back and visit and explore any additional new introduced hazards? Um, yeah, I think yeah, I've said a lot today. In fact, I'm surprised that we're just down to sort of 13 minutes. I want to take the opportunity now. If there's any questions, you can either put your hand up and our host will take you off mute. Jessica will take you off mute, or you can put them in the chat. Is there anything that I might be able to answer? Anything that's come from the presentation that I can be supportive with? We talked a lot. Yeah, okay. So, hey, Tinny, yeah. If you're federally regulated, yeah, you're the COCR. it's a different definition. It's different legislation. I can certainly happy to have a conversation with you to understand what that looks like at the federal level, Tanya. No problem at all. Yeah, we can conversate. Just reach out to me, and I'm happy to have that conversation to outline federal requirements for you because they are different. As you're likely aware, the confined space is hazardous, confined space and hazardous confined space at the federal level, and there's two different definitions there. But yeah, happy to connect with you to undertake that. Hey, great question, Morgan. That is a great question. I'm glad you asked that. So if you only use contractors in confined spaces, what are the bare minimums the company with the confined space needs to provide? Sure. So I'm glad you brought this up. This is one of the real major ones that comes up is you sub out that responsibility for confined space entry to a contractor, but it does not release you from liability and responsibility. So just because you have a contractor entering spaces does still trigger you to have a program. Your job is to, um, you know, it's up to the contractor to, if it's their employer. This is the misconception, is that a contractor will come to site, and this happened to me at Toyota too. This contractor comes to site, and as we know, and as I indicated, before any worker enters a space, a hazard assessment has to be done. In some instances, the organization or your organization can provide a baseline hazard assessment and just simply saying, hey, based on our knowledge of the equipment, these are the hazards that we see, right? We don't enter it, but we know that there's moving parts inside. We know there's these energy sources, etc. And you can provide that baseline assessment to a contractor. It doesn't include a safe entry plan, nor does it include a rescue plan. You're not performing those things. You're simply providing an assessment that states that here's the hazards that we're aware of. It's incumbent upon that contractor to take your baseline assessment and either add elements to it, because you can't predict what they're doing, right? How do you know how they perform their work, or what chemicals they're introducing, or what hazards they're introducing? It's their responsibility to take your baseline assessment, and if that doesn't exist, start from scratch. They'd be responsible to complete a hazard assessment, entry plan, and rescue plan. They would provide that to you for your review. Based on your competency, your knowledge scope, you would look at that and make decisions whether what they're telling you sounds reasonable. And here's one of the most common ones, is that contractors will get away with entering vertical spaces with no rescue. Their rescue, they'll indicate, is, hey, let's pretend I'm the organization. They'll say, hey, Craig, yeah, we're going to put a worker into that space. It's 20 feet down. There's a ladder going down. They're on a harness, and we have a lifeline. We're just going to pull them up. Me and my buddy here, we're pretty strong. We work out at the gym. We're just going to pull that person up. That is not adequate. That is a fairy tale. Um, that's why mechanical advantage the system exists, because manually manipulating somebody out of a space on a rope is not real. The brawniest firefighter I know cannot do that. That's not an adequate solution. That is quite common that I see. But in terms of your question, you do have to have a program, but the program outlines the responsibilities for the contractor as well, right? You have expectations that they have the same expectations to enter your space as if they were entering a space in their own property. And Morgan, for sure, we can, if you do want to connect, we can sort of filter down through anything else that you need through that question as well. You can simply reach out. I'd be happy to talk to you. No problem. That's a great question though, too. And you're right, there's some gray areas in that regard. Okay, coordination document. Yes. So that's a great question too, Patrick. And there is a little bit of misunderstanding that as well. That's only required. It would be an appendice in the program, and it's only required in the circumstance where a contractor and an employer, or a worker's employer, or sorry, an employer's worker rather, are in the same space at the same time. It doesn't necessarily just mean because we're subcontracting work, we're going to work on a coordination document. Although using a Denwacho or something to, if it is a shutdown or something to prevent conflict is always a great tool, but however, the legal expectation for utilizing a coordination document is to assign roles and responsibilities for each work party in the space at the same time. Who is doing rescue, who is doing X, making sure that there's absolutely no confusion and delineating responsibility between the two groups. And again, happy to have deeper conversations on any of these topics as well. Yes, they do. Yeah, and for sure, Julian, and what I have, and I'm happy to share with you, is a very, very descriptive email outlining all the sections, both contained in the Act and regulations, where this is inferred, that it is, um, yeah, that's a great tool. And you know why? I literally, Julie, created the email so I didn't have to justify that concern. Um, I was justifying it, as I mentioned, based on data, based on legislation, and I'm sure I'll be sharing that email with you. If anybody else would like or gets pushback, perhaps there's people in the group here that are receiving that pushback saying, hey, we would never go in it in this state. We would always make it like this. We would always do these things before we go in, and therefore it's not a confined space. I'm happy to give you supportive legislation to support that that's not the case. It's throughout the regs and guidelines that we assess equipment capturing all the hazards, not just the ones that we're turning off conveniently. So just a reminder, just before we conclude, I want to thank you for your valuable time. I'm a bit of a safety confined space nerd, and I always enjoy having conversation with like-minded individuals, sharing on this topic for anyone that will listen to me. Um, Brian, yeah, I'll answer that question in 1 second. I'm just gonna come to that. Um, when we do shut down, as I mentioned, there is an email that's coming out. It contains a link to the MLTSD survey, I think in the chat, and then there's a couple resources for you guys to access. But please reach out to me as well if you want to have a conversation. That's what we do at WSPS. We conversate with the workforce, right? There's no charge for that to have a candid conversation about some of your needs and explore how we can help you. Let me just go through this last question, then we'll conclude. We've got 4 minutes left. We have some examples where we have work where workers are hooked to a davit arm or over a pit identified as confined space, where pumping, washing, cleaning is happening over and above the confined space, definitely breaking the plane, but tied off to a davit arm. You know what? Brian, I love filtering through these kinds of questions. Okay, if you want to just take my email, give me your availability, either this week or next. There we go. Yeah, reach out to me, and I'm happy to just pick a time, and we'll filter through some of these questions in a little bit more detail. They're all great questions, and I'm glad that you brought them up because they're relevant. Yeah, please don't hesitate to reach out. Uh, with that being said, if there are no more questions, I certainly thank everybody for their valuable time. I respect people's time, and I thank you for yours today. I hope you got something out of the session, and hopefully we can connect again.